Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that's Union Jack is big, girthy, and definitely up to government standard. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm still reeling from that joke, as possibly our listeners are as well. I wasn't expecting that. This is why I let you write the jokes.
The thing about that joke is it wasn't even like a headline, that story, so I'm not even going to talk about it even more on the app. You either know,
no, it's just there.
Know.
Yep, there you go.
Yeah,
enjoy. one for the listeners at home. I'm pretty good. I think we mentioned in our pre-show ramble that was for the Patreon subscribers that I've been visiting work slightly more often, which is kind of nice. Get out of the house. But I suppose we're going to actually start talking about the state of play with that in our headlines. So let's just roll straight on into our headlines. We have two related headlines this week. So first from The Times, setback for Britain's COVID rollout. And then from the Daily Mail, jabs in crisis. What's going on there, Rob?
Yeah, this is the news that, we've been quite complimentary of everything that's been happening in the UK recently with our vaccine jab rollout program. As of yesterday, I believe that 51% of all adults in the UK have now had their first jab in some shape, form or another. And to the other 48%, I say, you lost, get over it, deal with it. Sorry, no, that's another thing.
Completely unrelated, yes.
Completely unrelated, sorry. So 51% have been vaccinated now, which is kind of incredible. Clearly, a lot of people are still waiting on their second jab, but it looks like we'll be one of the first countries in the world to get towards like a large proportion of its adult population being vaccinated quite soon. I think Israel is the other one that's done incredibly well so far. I think they've got something like up to 75% there, and they're starting to see things open up again.
Yeah, they were very ahead of us, I think. I do actually know someone in Israel who was sharing photos of like a family picnic the other day. I don't know if that was I just saw pictures of the picnic itself, so I don't know how many people went, but I think they're definitely more open than we are. And I think, I don't know if it's on our list to discuss here, but they have a kind of vaccine passport system where once you've got your vaccine, you can do stuff out and about more often.
I know that's being touted here, although there are some people who are very much against it on almost like human rights grounds of, might force people to get vaccinations who don't want them. But yes, that's maybe another discussion for another day. The problem, or one of the big barriers it's facing now, is the problem of production and keeping up with that demand. So these headlines that were from yesterday's papers, I believe, they're sort of pointing out that production for the Oxford vaccine has slowed over in India, and that might cause a slight delay in some people getting their jabs. Now, the government has already said that people who've already got their first will definitely have their second. And I think that, the UK getting the fact that the UK has so many manufacturing plants based in the UK itself does mean that we're at a slight advantage for getting more people their jabs, even if there is this delay from production overseas. But it is kind of the first snag we've had in a vaccine program that has been quite successful overall. The other thing I want to mention, and that Daily Mail headline, jabs in crisis, it kind of had two problems on the front. One was this one for the UK, and the second one was this big kerfuffle that's going on with the EU and vaccines. And of course, earlier in the week, we had a bit of drama where the EU stopped using the vaccine for a bit, or at least some countries said they wouldn't use it because there were reports of blood clots happening in patients. I think there were only reports of blood clots happening in 37 out of however many hundreds of thousands people have been vaccinated. So an incredibly small sample, and probably something that you would say the benefits of the jab maybe outweigh the risk. But I think it's clear that maybe some of the decisions the EU there were making was more political. And I wanted to make a slightly deeper dive into why the EU is being seen as having got its vaccine program wrong, when actually they may have just had some unfortunate decision making early on that's kind of left itself in this position. Because I think if you read the UK papers, a lot of them are still kind of post-Brexit, anything the EU does is wrong, like that kind of attitude about it, and they're just trying to do this to spite us because of Brexit. There's actually a lot of things going under the hood for this. So I've got a long, detailed explanation. Apologies in advance.
That's fine. Just before you push on into your longer explanation, I just want to mention a few things about that thing about the thrombosis and blood clotting happening in the vaccine. So there's a few things to push back on here. So basically, in some papers in some European countries, basically people are like, that they've paused this because they need to check this. And that is the medicine agencies working as they should to check that something is safe. So that is not abnormal. There's been other studies earlier in the year, and I've seen, like, the problem is people who have vaccine hesitancy or are vaccine deniers will kind of jump on these things and be like, look, it's unsafe because of this. Whereas this is completely, so the first thing is it's completely normal, nothing to be worried about. Like, this is what we do, is we have to check if there is some strange instance. So the first thing I want to point out with the AZ one is that, so this story was published about the AZ one. There was a really good tweet, not quite showing the exact same period of time, but it was like a very similar period of time, and it shows basically the same kind of numbers from in the UK between Pfizer and AstraZeneca, spontaneous reports. There's slightly more deep vein thrombosis for AstraZeneca, but like we're talking like 6 out of 14. We're not talking very large numbers here, considering the number of people who've been vaccinated. And the other thing is, I believe, although I would have to go and double check this exactly, but I believe someone pointed out that it's essentially the incidence rate of those things in the normal population without a vaccine. So there's no difference between AZ and Pfizer, essentially, and there doesn't seem to be any difference between that and what would just happen to you going about your life. So that's why these medicine agencies have now said it's all fine, but they did have to do their due diligence on that, because that's why we have medicine agencies. They have to go check these things. So that's just to put out there, if anyone is worried about it, that's why it's okay that these things are happening. It's because it's basically the same as if you weren't having the vaccine. So it's not the vaccine causing it.
Thank you. That's very clear. Thank you. That really has cleared it up for me. It has for our listeners as well. So on to this. So this has been rumbling in the background for a while, and I've wanted to do a deeper dive on it, but haven't really had an opportunity to, because there's been a lot of talk in the papers about the EU threatening to ban exports of the biotech Pfizer vaccine to the UK, and there being a bit of a disagreement about them not getting the vaccines that they're owed. So I just wanted to say how this has come about and why the EU maybe has a little bit of, right to feel aggrieved in some sense, and also why maybe they are seen as taking political decisions when really they should be worried about people's health, etc., etc. So we've got our 2 vaccines, just to put this out there. So we've got the Oxford AstraZeneca one, and we've got the biotech Pfizer one. Okay. The biotech one is the one that was created in Germany, but they partnered with Pfizer, who are a US company. And the US is, so that US branch is responsible for a lot of manufacture of the Pfizer biotech vaccine. You also have the Oxford AstraZeneca one, which is completely funded by the which is the Oxford one is, a UK company, and AstraZeneca is also a UK company, and a lot of manufacturing happens within the UK itself. What is natural once the pandemic became a thing and developed countries started to look to invest in vaccines early on, a lot of them hedged their bets and spread their funding over a variety of vaccines just in case theirs didn't work. We've talked about like the French one, for example, which has now been pulled. We've got these 3 or 4 ones now that are out there in the wild. They're working. There's no point in anybody really developing another one because you've got something that works. So Europe, as well as investing in their biotech one, said, right, we will have a purchasing agreement with AstraZeneca, which is the UK one. And they agreed that one day before the UK did. So this is kind of where the EU is saying, hey, we are owed our vaccine. We paid for it first. However, the UK government has a counterpoint to this. Basically, they partnered with Oxford before Oxford partnered with AstraZeneca and paid some money before them. And part of that research agreement clause essentially said, hey, if we're paying for this research, you owe us any doses of the vaccine first before you start giving it out to other countries. Europe and the EU, most crucially, didn't make that clause with biotech in Germany. And when they partnered with Pfizer, the US company, Pfizer has most of the manufacturing capability is based in the US which means that once that vaccine became available, the US manufacturing plants essentially put an export ban on the Pfizer vaccine manufactured in the USA. So you have a situation where the biotech Pfizer vaccine, everything made in America, doesn't go outside of America. And the plants that you've got in Belgium, for example, have to not only supply Europe, but they're also sending jabs to Canada, Mexico, all across the world, where you'd think in any sort of normal logistical state, if you were a Canada, sure, I will get the same vaccine from our neighbours. They can deliver it in a truck. But no, because the US has controlled that and the output of it, and there's an export ban on it, Europe can't get as much access to that Pfizer drug first as they would want. So that's what's leading to their shortfall in their own vaccine. So then they go to the UK and say, oi, we would like a dose of our of the AstraZeneca one, please. The problem with that was that the UK and the US approved use of the Oxford AstraZeneca jab about 2 to 3 weeks before the EU, because the EU was maybe a little bit more cautious about, their clinical trials to make sure everything was safe, which, as we've mentioned before, that's entirely what you should do when you're dealing with an untested vaccine. You want to make sure it's completely safe. So when the EU said 2 to 3 weeks after the US and the UK, right, we're ready, can we have our first dose of Oxford jabs, please? AstraZeneca said, actually, this is a bit awkward. You weren't ready, so we gave our supply to the UK, who's ready. And also, if you dispute this, we've got a clause in our contract, which means that we've got to supply to the UK first. So the EU is kind of in this weird hamstrung position where it can't get access to the AstraZeneca jab on the scale that it wants. And its own manufacturing is sort of either all going to the US first, which of course has a massive population, and then its own production of that jab is going out all over the world. It can't just prioritize the EU. It's having to send it to everybody else who contractually said, we want a big dose of this vaccine. Some might say that this was sort of a bit naive on the EU's part for kind of thinking that other countries would just want to spread a vaccine as far and wide as possible and not worry about these exclusivity clauses. However, I don't think it's surprising that the US and the UK would want to help its own people first before spreading that out. But I think it is a bigger moral question, maybe, particularly when we're looking at, this is a wider question, but there's like patent protection and how much you can sell the vaccine to other countries. A lot of the people who don't want to extend that patent protection are like the EU, UK, US example, whereas African countries, poorer countries in general, that still need the same access to the vaccine, they're kind of being denied it until a later date because it's being hoarded by the richer countries that want to get their populations vaccinated first. And the EU is kind of the more, maybe, as I said, naive, wealthier partner in this, who's found itself kind of left in the lurch about not being able to get the supply of vaccine, even though it's one of those countries that built it. So I just wanted to say it wasn't an entirely political scandal. It wasn't like an entirely scandal that's just been made up by the EU. There are certain reasons they feel, a right to be aggrieved, but maybe it was very smart planning on both the US and the UK's part to have those clauses in place to make sure that they served their own countries first before getting it out, because I think the success of the vaccine rollout so far is certainly proving to be popular amongst the general population and might be the thing that sort of saves Boris Johnson or saves how you think about Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party in the long run. They may have mishandled the crisis in the early days, and I think, quite rightly, an inquiry should go on to that and see what happened. There's a reason why the UK has one of the largest death tolls in Europe for COVID. But now with the vaccine rollout, that's seen as basically a success, and it might be able to save their reputation in a sense.
Yeah. I think one more thing I want to add is, as you say, that there's like multiple overlapping things here. There's obviously what you see in the newspapers kind of veers towards Brexit, as you mentioned, and then there's similar things over in the EU where different countries have different, their different newspapers are saying different things. And I think there was a lot of like newspapers saying, oh, the AZ jab is unsafe. And now suddenly they want more of it. Like it's this weird, interesting kind of how it flips on a dime. But the other thing that I found interesting talking to some German and French people online is that I had not realized that vaccine hesitancy, etc., is stronger in Europe, because I always think of it as, I know we have a bit of a problem about it here. We saw that with the MMR stuff back in the day. But I think that I always think of it as more of a US-centric problem. And it seems like while it gets mentioned, I haven't heard any like stories directly from the US, maybe because I don't, have like my finger on the button as much about how that is in the US itself. I just kind of assume it's more of a problem, but it sounds like maybe it's been less of a problem when it comes to this. And then in France, I think particularly, there has been quite a lot of kind of vaccine hesitancy around it because there's a bit more distrust of the government in France, I think, in general, is my understanding of it. So it's interesting to me that there are these countries where I wouldn't at first glance expect them to have as many problems with uptake. But that, coupled with how their media has been portraying the AstraZeneca vaccine up until now, has really kind of led to an odd set of circumstances. I'm not sure we can really pick all of this apart within the headline segment, which is supposed to be kind of short. But if you want to go into a deeper dive into this kind of information, the BBC has a podcast called How to Vaccinate the World with Tim Harford, the economist, which has been very interesting. And they talk a bit more at length about these issues, and they've also discussed kind of the morality of providing vaccines to, should we be ensuring that every country in the world gets the same percentage of vaccines at the start, or as you say, should they be, should countries finish off their vaccination program, then give their spares elsewhere, and so on. And they tackle that issue kind of in a more longer format. So I think maybe that's a podcast we can point people towards. And then our next headline is from the Daily Mail: Electoral probe into number 10 Decor scandal. That's a lot of keywords.
Yeah, so this is kind of a scandal that's been bubbling on in the background and has kind of been pushed to one side or another because of, COVID or royal family or whatever's been dominating the front pages. But this is a Daily Mail expose that goes into what might be possibly an abuse of how party funds are used to fund certain elements of Boris Johnson's lifestyle. So there was some works done to Boris and Carrie's flat where they live with their new child, and the renovation costs were up to £200,000. And there is a suggestion that the Daily Mail has reported that up to £60,000 of party funds were used to help cover that work. Now, if this was the case, then some say that this would be a big breach of, how you're meant to spend party funds. People usually donate to the Conservative Party to, fund political campaigning, not doing up the Prime Minister's private residence. And it's now been revealed that the Electoral Commission will go in and see what's happened. Now, if, of course, the Electoral Commission does find wrongdoing, that will have serious repercussions for the Prime Minister, and in the olden days may have been the kind of scandal that brought down a Prime Minister. Now, we are not in the olden days. It does seem that this government has been able to go through, like the Dominic Cummings scandal and not, have him resign. It's gone through the Priti Patel scandal with bullying, and she hasn't had to resign. So there is a big question mark about what actually a government minister or even the Prime Minister has to do in order to step back from their role if they've committed any wrongdoing. But the fact that it's the Daily Mail reporting this, and that this is a scandal very much targeted towards the Prime Minister himself. Like it's not a wider, the Conservative Party are following this electoral policy. It's very much the Prime Minister and his fiancée redid their flat by misusing party funds. That might be a bigger scandal, and if proven true, could derail him somewhat. It seems pretty small now and hasn't really got other papers' headline attention yet, so I don't think it's generating the kind of steam that would remove a Prime Minister at the moment, but it is definitely one of those things to keep an eye on and just see if it grows depending on the outcomes of that inquiry. Because, like I say, it's quite a serious misuse and really not what you should be using £60,000 for.
Yeah, I mean, it in some ways it's kind of refreshing to have a traditional, normal scandal. Remember the expenses scandal back in the day? That was kind of the big political news at the time. I imagine in the current climate this won't stick around. But yeah, as you say, it would have brought down not that it would have brought down lesser governments, but it definitely would have brought down governments in the past. And somehow all of this seems to just kind of avoid Boris in a way. I mean, it's interesting because I think the thing is it just doesn't affect his base, and it's a bit kind of similar to like the kind of discussions we had around Trumpism before, where I don't think it's exactly the same over here in the UK, but people who voted for Boris are like don't care that he does these things. Like that's not part of the thing they seem to care about, whereas it's like there may be public outcry, but not everyone voted for Boris in the first place. So I think it's interesting kind of how many scandals there have to be like this, and the question is how is that affecting public feeling on him, especially people who voted for him, because I think people who didn't vote for him are already pretty made up on the idea of whether Boris is a good thing or not.
Yeah, I think if Boris's opinion polls were down like they were before we had any vaccine rollout and after some of that mismanagement, because he was dwindling in the polls quite significantly until we had the vaccine come out, it might have hit him a bit harder. It might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. But for the moment, he seems to be keeping his head above water. Or, like you say, COVID's going on, vaccines are going out, we want to get our lives back to normal. It's fine. I can brush this expenses thing to the side. Just as long as he gets us out of this, I'll be happy. And I think there's a lot of people who might be thinking that way in quite like a short-term view. That it will be, if it's proven by the Electoral Commission that funds have been misused, expect it to be a constant line of attack from like Labour politicians, the SNP, etc., going on into the future. And it's another one of those big question marks of, will Boris Johnson survive to another election? The Conservatives might win the next election, but with Boris Johnson at the helm, I think that's still like a big question mark. And these type of scandals certainly don't help his chances any.
Yeah. Moving on to our main story tonight. We're going to be discussing the Sarah Everard case and kind of the wider discussion that's happened after that. You'll have seen this in the news, I'm sure, but that's just kind of, I suppose, this is a heads up. That's the thing we're going to be talking about, which obviously could be distressing for some people. So I'll just say that up front.
We won't be dwelling on like the details of the case, but clearly it's something that, affects a large swathe of the population in ways that both me and you can never quite comprehend.
We can't speak from personal experience about some of the things we're going to be talking about, so we will just try and give good examples that have come up in the online discussion following all of this in the last few weeks. So, Rob, do you want to fill us in on what actually happened?
Yeah, so the very base details of the case are that Sarah went missing around about March 3rd. It made front headline news, and unfortunately, as searches went on a week later, her body was found on Clapham Common, and the main suspect responsible for her disappearance was a serving Met police officer called Wayne Couzens. Clearly a very tragic case, but one made all the more alarming that the victim's attacker in this case was a member of an organisation that's specific duty is designed to sort of like protect and serve people like Sarah. They shouldn't be a threat, as this is what happened with Wayne Couzens. So clearly this case touched, had massive social awareness and brought to light a lot of things that women have been experiencing all their lives. I think it is comparable to a kind of Me Too movement online. Obviously that was focused around other subject matter, but this one in particular was, people sharing their experiences of, simply walking home at night or walking in a street alone, which is, as you mentioned up top, it's something that me as a bloke, I can't really, I haven't had the same experiences. Or if I've ever been walking along and felt threatened while I was walking alone at night, it is because of a group or one man. I can never think of an experience where I felt uncomfortable walking at night because there's a woman walking alone in the street. And it's that kind of stuff that strikes you about this. And I think it was such a big story that touched everybody that I felt we had to talk about it, and the subsequent reaction and what's happened in the police and in the wider government is certainly like a cause for concern. What's happened there.
And I think, so one of the big events were women on Twitter and elsewhere, talking about their experiences of walking alone or, on a fairly empty street at night, and how they have to adjust their behaviour to feel safe, when really it should be men adjusting their behaviour to make women feel safe, so they don't feel threatened in these situations. And I think coupled with the fact we also had a poll, I think, was it a poll, a YouGov poll that came out? Yeah, so that I mean, I think it was 97%, but basically nearly everyone who responded to that poll who was a woman said that they had experienced some kind of sexual harassment. So I think it's more that, like, I think you'd be very hard placed to have read stuff post Me Too and everything else and be in a situation where if you weren't a woman, you weren't aware that there were problems in society. But I think the fact that it's basically every woman ever in the UK who's experienced this is that should be alarming to anyone. Like the fact that people may have assumed it was less people who had been affected, but the fact that basically every respondent to that poll said that they had experienced it, that's a key thing that I think was part of the talking points, because it's a problem, but that shows the scale of the problem. And I think for some people that was a thing they hadn't realized. And I think as well, it's easy if you don't have to change your behavior normally because of people around you to forget these kind of things. So, I mean, I have definitely been in the situation where I've clocked that I'm walking behind someone and I've realized, oh, that might be really awful for them. I should speed up or I should swap sides of the street and stuff. And I've done that before, but it would be kind of a thing where occasionally I'd be like, oh, like it's kind of a realization in the moment as opposed to being fully aware of it all the time. And I think the important thing about these conversations is that it has helped highlight the kind of things that people can do. And even if you were doing some of them, you need to be doing them more often. If you're a bloke like walking along the streets, like, cross the street, obviously, to make it obvious that you're getting out of the way of someone and things like that, I think can help in these situations. There was a lot of stuff online. Again, we'll probably just post some links to some good resources, but you need to be aware of those kind of things more often. And I think it's easy. It's similar to a lot of the stuff we discussed in the BLM episode, and also stuff that's been discussed at length around Me Too as well, where it's about, if you're in a position of privilege, it's kind of about you have to do these things to make it easier for people who are not in that position of privilege. And it's easy to not be aware of those when you're in a position of privilege because you don't experience those negative things. And that's essentially what we've set up, when we mentioned this at the start. But yeah, you have to try and be more aware of these things, and you may not always get it right, but you need to start thinking about these things more, and then you can kind of spread the social burden, I suppose, of these things, as opposed to all being one group of people who have to deal with worrying about this. If everyone is trying to fix it, then it helps spread that burden off the people who currently have to deal with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I think these suggested changes in behavior, for example, crossing the street, giving distance, etc., these are incredibly easy changes for men to make. There's no sort of financial barrier to them. There's no sort of great inconvenience out of my day or my time just to cross the street. Simply, it's just something that once you've thought about, you can go, oh yeah, I can do that. And it's just a little thing that can help make people feel safer, which is why I think it's always so ridiculous that unfortunately you get these sort of like counter messages on social media. There was one hashtag that was going around particularly as a response to this, saying like hashtag not all men, which I would ridicule and compare to the sort of all lives matter movement that happened after Black Lives Matter. It's yes, of course I'm aware that not all men attack women at night, but unfortunately far too many do. And if you had a bag of Skittles and 1 in 10 was poisonous, you wouldn't just carry on eating the Skittles regardless. You would try and change your actions to identify that and move away and solve that problem. So you can't just pretend the problem doesn't exist, which I feel like those hashtags, like saying not all men examples, they're trying to brush the problem away rather than deal with it head on. And yeah, this one in particular, this case in particular, I thought highlighted a lot of instances of what can happen, and particularly put a spotlight on the Metropolitan Police, because it was one of their own members that is now alleged to have partaken in this event.
That was also kind of the shocking part. Obviously the police were looking for a missing person, and then you find out that the reason was a police officer. That very much changes perceptions. And I think we talked about this again. We talked about these kind of topics again when we were talking about Black Lives Matter, with more of a focus on the US. But again, if you're a woman and you would go to the cops to look after you, then after this you hear this kind of story and you go, well, can I trust going to the cops? Because if it's a male cop, then I don't know if I can trust them. And so, like, I think that's the problem. Sorry, that's not the problem. There is a baseline, problem below all of this, but I think that's one of the big issues that's come here. Like, the very people who are supposed, as you mentioned earlier on, the very people who are meant to help you in this situation being the cause, not only is there a lack in public confidence after that, but yeah, that shows you how stark the problem is.
Precisely. And I think if there is a loss of faith in those organizations that are meant to protect you, then one way of trying to make everybody feel safer, regardless of that, is social change, which is why they're trying to get this. Like, if we can't rely on the police, then maybe we can rely on each other to change our behavior, and, other men looking at this and seeing how they can change their behavior to try and mitigate this in the future. Like, I think that's why it becomes such a catalyst for change.
So I just want to also on that point address the not all men hashtag kind of thing, which is, I think if seeing these events doesn't make you stop and take stock of, like, you could be the nicest person in the world, but the point is that just your presence on a street at night walking near someone is causing them anxiety and to be worried about you. Like, so that's the thing. It doesn't matter if you're the nicest person in the world. There's probably something you're not doing that could help in these situations. And I think that's the thing you need to take away from it. Like, if you say not all men, you're just saying, oh, well, I'm fine. I think that's the thing. Like, if as you said, your Skittle analogy was really good. People work on percentages, like, and probabilities in their heads. That's, well, those fruits are dangerous, those fruits are safe, kind of thing. Like, that's how we act as people. And just using the hashtag not all men doesn't fix anything. it's just, as you say, it's brushing it off. It's trying to not take any responsibility. And it's like, you may have not realized that you being in a place was causing a problem for other people, but you need to put yourself in those people's shoes and have a think about it and see if you could change your actions to make life better for everyone. And that's exactly what you mean. This social change, you need to. It can be a hard conversation. Like if you look over stuff in retrospect, you can be like, oh, I did something and that was really bad. In retrospect, kind of, we're not talking like things that are arrestable offences and stuff like that. We're talking like if the average person takes stock of like things they've done that have like could have caused someone else to be worried or whatever. I think every man could sit down and work out a list of things that they've probably done, and that's the kind of a similar thing happened with the Black Lives Matter movement, where and everything over the summer, where you had to kind of like sit down and be like, when have I accidentally been racist? Like that's the point, is that society is currently structured in such a way that you are doing these things without realizing. So you need to stop and try and realize what those things are, because then you will realize, oh, I'm doing all these little minor things all the time that I hadn't realized were a problem. And then that's how you can adjust your behavior. If you just say, use a hashtag and try and brush it off, that's not going to help.
Yeah, certainly.
So as we mentioned, it was a police officer who is the suspect. And then there was a vigil for Sarah. Many women got out to reclaim the streets and have a vigil. And then, of course, that was policed by the very police service that were kind of involved here. So how did that end up?
Yeah, so like you've mentioned, there was an organisation called Reclaim These Streets that wanted to go ahead and have a vigil for Sarah on Clapham Common in London. Now, to do a sort of event of this size, they have to make it known to the Metropolitan Police that this many people are going to be gathering. It usually wouldn't be too much of an issue, but obviously under COVID regulations, there are certain rules that stop so many people gathering in one place. So a request was put forward, essentially, but there are also laws that exist about human rights and a right to protest, or in this case, as Reclaim These Streets professed, they said that, look, this isn't even a protest, we just want to do a vigil, a memorial for this person, and then we will disperse. So a judge refused to rule in either way in favour of the Met or Reclaim These Streets. However, Reclaim These Streets decided to abandon the idea of a vigil officially because the group would have faced a £10,000 fine from the police for breaching COVID rules. However, this meant that the Reclaim These Streets offer of providing stewards to protect those people on the event. You know, when you ever get large groups of people together, there is always a need to provide some sort of security to make sure that everybody is safe. Reclaim These Streets wanted to provide its own security because, well, in this particular case, obviously the person who was a victim was, you know, the alleged offender there is a member of the Metropolitan Police. So having the Metropolitan Police police that is maybe not the best thing for those people. You know, they're not the best group of people to have around the people wanting to go to the vigil. However, as I said, Reclaim These Streets were denied that permission. People said they would turn up anyway. Because naturally by now the movement to have that vigil had gained such traction online that people said that they would. So on Saturday evening, a large crowd of people gathered with police sort of in the distance. At around about 6 p.m, speeches started at the bandstand, and that appears to be the moment where the police started to move in and arrest protesters. There was lots of footage shared of this online, and most notably there was the image of Patsy Stevenson, who is the red-headed lady, who you can see in most of like on the front pages, being like just arrested out of seemingly nowhere. I would say, like if you were taking the letter of the law strictly on your hand, you would say you could arrest that person for breaching COVID rules. You could have arrested anybody on that common for breaching COVID rules, in my opinion. The point is that the police should see when their actions might exacerbate a scenario and when it might cause more tension. And my argument would say in this instance, certainly the police moving in and acting in certainly a fairly heavy-handed manner certainly was a very bad look for them, particularly given the circumstances of what happened for Sarah. It was particularly bad PR and has led to the Dick Out campaign on Twitter because the head of the Metropolitan Police is Cressida Dick, who is the first female Met Commissioner in its history. She faced calls for to resign, basically has said that she won't resign, but she would welcome a public inquiry into what happened on Clapham Common that evening. But I certainly think that the events on Clapham Common didn't help restore faith in the Metropolitan Police for those who found it was shaken and their ability to protect women. It appeared to be, heavy-handed and unnecessary. Particularly when you compare it to similar protests or similar events that happened outside. So,
I mean, bearing in mind there are protests against the COVID regulations at the moment that aren't really getting broken up. I think there were some photos circulating from this weekend. There was another anti-COVID protest, and by which I mean not people who are against the virus, but people who think we should not be locked down, etc. And so, surely they're, if like they're not only are they kind of breaching those rules, but like they're actively like fighting against them. And don't get me wrong, like people should be allowed to protest anyway. And I think there's a wider point with regards to that we need to talk about in a minute. But yeah, it's similar to how there were the same thing happened over the summer where there was more heavy-handedness against Black Lives Matter protests than there was against other protests that were going on at the same time. And that disparity should not be there.
Precisely. The one that struck my mind was that up in Scotland, football team Rangers have won their first title in over 10 years. And COVID restrictions are quite strict up in Scotland at the moment. However, a sort of victory parade, march, whatever happened through the centre of Glasgow for Rangers fans. And because there were so many people there, the police sort of lined the streets to make sure that everybody passed, everything passed without incident. As somebody, myself, who goes to a lot of football games, the police are there, but they'd never sort of get involved to start arresting people if they thought it would exacerbate a situation. And they certainly showed no signs of arresting people for this march, even though they were celebrating a football win, something that seems incredibly trivial when you compare it to, the vigil that was happening for Sarah. And what's the big difference between those two groups? Well, one was made up of mostly women and the other one is made up of mostly male football fans who have a very different kind of like relationship with the police. And I think police guidelines for that group would certainly be to take off a more hands-off approach for football fans for fear of, causing more trouble by instigating violence if they were to get involved. So why did the Met Police feel the need to get involved in such a way where the Sarah one, it raises a lot of questions and appears to be sort of like a clear disparity, much like you said when you're comparing what happened with Black Lives Matter protesters who were nearly universally like unarmed and majority peaceful, you would say, in the US, and then compare that to like the fully armed, those people who would carry firearms openly and break COVID rules in the US, going against like I think it was the Arizona governor, for example, the police treated those protesters with kid gloves in comparison to what they did to the Black Lives Matter protesters. So again, it's not only has it raised issues around women's rights and how you deal with that, but also, how the police and how organizations deal with people. Are they treating both groups with in a similar manner? They should, but it appears in practice, the evidence shows otherwise.
We've touched there on like how there's a disparity in how these protests are being handled. I did mention briefly these kind of anti-COVID law protests, and I think we should tie that into the fact that there is a new bill, the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, that seems to be restricting rights to protest. I mean, this is my opinion here and my impression, but my impression is that our current Home Secretary and also the government are not fans of protest. And I feel like protests have got... I feel like there's maybe been more protests or maybe they're more advertised, but I also feel like less people maybe attend them now. That's the thing I don't have any hard numbers for. That's just a feeling. But I also think that I'm also concerned that the government is trying to crack down on protest, which should be a thing that's allowed in a democracy. And I think a lot of other people sort of had those same kind of concerns. And I think maybe a thing to kind of draw a comparison with here is, do you remember the student protests back in around, I think it must have been like 2011, 2012?
Yeah, yes, I do. Yeah, there was quite significant disruption in London, wasn't there, around that time? I mean, across the country, but I remember the London ones were stuck in my mind.
This made me think about, I was trying to put it into my terms because, I wasn't there at the Vigil, but I do support people who have been protesting in these times. And I was trying to put this into kind of a frame of reference for me. And I remember, so I didn't go down with the student protests to London because I was up in Manchester at the time as a student. I had the option to, and I think a load of people got bussed down there on coaches or something, but I think I was doing something in the afternoon, whatever it was, it worked out I couldn't be free all day, so I couldn't go down to London. What I distinctly remember is a group of students protesting in Manchester walking up and down like the main road. And I remember them having a police charge kind of around them and like not at them necessarily, but around them, because a police charge on horseback is scary to watch. And so it kind of sticks in my memory. And it's kind of, I think there's often this thing that can happen where you reduce a group to like a few bad people. So like during a protest, I'm sure there are some people who, go along to I'm sure you can find someone at a protest who goes along and does something bad. And we had similar conversations around Black Lives Matter in America earlier in the year, last year, where, one or two people maybe did something, but you're like, are those people who have come along, are they actually counter protesters who are trying to get the protesters in trouble? You have all of this stuff. And there definitely was some property damage that happened from those student protests. But again, it's like 3 or 4 people out of a large group. So to kind of like kettle people and then charge them with horses and stuff like that seems completely unreasonable when the vast majority of those people are there to protest peacefully. And so I don't know how many of our listeners have been involved in some kind of protest or another. Most of them in the UK do go fairly peacefully, and you can just chat to the police when you're there. But I think there is this kind of problem where when there's 1 or 2 people in the group who start to cause a problem, that suddenly like there's this switch where it's like, well, this is a group of angry protesters, like a violent mob, and you're like, well, most of those people just want to protest and aren't causing a problem. And I think there's probably an issue around that needs to be resolved. And I also don't think that this law that's trying to go through Parliament at the moment is going to help.
No, if anything, it restricts how you can protest quite severely, or puts limits on what makes illegal protests, to the point where you can really question what's the point of protesting. But I wanted to go through those in a bit more detail. So one of the first things it does is that there are more conditions police can put on protests. So example, the police can impose start and finish times and maximum noise levels on a range of protests in England and Wales. So essentially that means that the police can say, yeah, you can have your protest, but we'll try and limit the disorder, damage and disruption that those protests cause. One of the issues about that is that the Home Secretary will decide the definition of serious disruption, and that leaves quite a lot of power in the hands of one person, and their interpretation is simply marching in Parliament Square a disruption, or is breaking shop windows a disruption? Like where is the sliding scale, and what the Home Secretary says there goes. So that is sort of like...
Sorry, there's a term of up to 10 years in jail. Like, and I appreciate that sentencing is not so, but like I can think of very few things that a protester could do during a protest that aren't already illegal that would be worthy of a 10-year fine. Like, I mean, property damage and stuff is covered by other laws, right?
Yeah, precisely. And there are, I'm not saying I'm an expert in law here, but there are some offences where you'd think that, the maximum sentence is not up to 10 years, but the maximum sentence is up to 10 years in jail for serious annoyance, is the phrase. And quite rightly, people have described this as being an incredibly vague thing to put in your law. Like, I can be seriously annoying sometimes to my wife. Does that mean I get up to 10 years in jail? It's that, but the fact that the government can implement it makes it incredibly concerning, and we'd be one of the few countries in the world that has that kind of level of jail sentence for merely protesting. The government's defense will be that, the 10-year one will obviously be used very, very sparingly, but the fact that it has up to 10 years or just serious annoyance, how it will be interpreted by the police, the courts, and then the Home Secretary is another cause for concern, and we often talk about kind of like balance of powers within politics and how you can have these levels of control on just how much influence the government has. If this bill were to pass, that's something that would certainly worry me, as how much power the government has and if you're going to a protest, are you in the back of your mind worried that you might be jailed for 10 years just because somebody interprets you as being annoying? Like, that's something that may dissuade protesters in the future from protests even going ahead, for example. There's some other small things in this bill that are a bit concerning. Loud hailers will be banned outside Parliament. I think they've kind of become a regular feature of Parliament, particularly when we had all that Brexit back and forth, and there were almost that, as the Brexit agreements sort of and those discussions in Parliament reached a crescendo, you had groups from both sides with loud hailers. It was often a case that they would disrupt interviews or shout slogans behind as the BBC were trying to interview parliamentarians in Parliament Square. It's even getting to the point where a one-person protests can face a crackdown. So you might recognise anti-Brexit protester Steve Bray. He's the man with the big top hat that used to shout things outside Parliament. He himself could be subject to these new rules that say, you one person protesting, we can put the same laws against you as we would a group of protesters, and say that you are being equally disruptive to an environment, that we can remove you and remove your right to protest, in a sense. Which is kind of scary that they can drill it down to that one person level. And one of the other points I just want to bring up,
I think is the one I just noticed while looking through the list. Is this the one about statues?
It is the one about statues, which is, we've talked about Black Lives Matter earlier, haven't we? And as a result of those protests in the UK, most notably, you had the Bristol slave trader, whose name escapes me at the moment, Colston. You had the Colston statue removed by protesters in Bristol, and that sparked up quite the debate about how you protect statues. Now, personally, I would rather protect people than statues, but the Conservatives seem particularly concerned about the rights of statues and their need to exist, and they've upped the penalty you can have for criminal damage from 3 months to 10 years in prison you can get for defacing or removing a statue.
It does not seem to me that is proportional to the act, which I think is like how laws should be, right? I don't think, bearing in mind, there's always some. I'm sure you can find you can always go through and find a story for like murder where someone got away with like a shorter time or whatever, and you're like, if someone can go to jail for murder for 5 years, I don't think it's reasonable that someone could go to jail for defacing a statue for 10.
Precisely, and I think that's the ultimate juxtaposition in your head where you go, that seems fairly severe, and like I say, it's for the right of statues is odd.
People have rights, statues don't. Is my simple summary of that. I think I did quite like the suggestion on. I think it was on. I can't remember which comedy show it was. One of the BBC comedy shows where they said they can just put because they're worried about the Churchill statue outside of Parliament being defaced, and they were just like, well, you could put it on like a spring mechanism, so people knock it down and it just goes back up on Monday, which I think would be a lot easier than all of this seems rather. Totalitarian is the phrase I would use.
Yes, and I've seen some graphs where people were showing maps of places where you can get up to 10 years for protesting, and I think if this bill passes, we'll be on a list with kind of like Saudi Arabia, Iran and North Korea, which tend to not be beacons of human rights throughout the world.
Generally not the list you want to be on, really.
No, not really. The government, in their defense of this 10 years thing, have said that it would be to focus on things like anti-Semitic graffiti, attacks on gravestones, war memorials to people who've been murdered, etc. So, that if you deface those, that might be what prompts the longer jail time. But still, I think, as we've said, that is, there are laws on hate speech that exist, and I don't think any of those are as severe as up to 10 years, for example. And the fact that most of this rhetoric has been around the Churchill statue. Unfortunately, on the same night of the Clapham Common incident, police were equally worried that it might be retaliatory sort of like attacks or something going on. So there were photos of police officers surrounding the Churchill statue on the same night, which led to the response on online social media platforms of here are police protecting statues, or they seem to want to protect statues more than they want to protect women walking home at night, etc. So it's, again, this statue chat unfortunately does sort of like boil into culture war territory, which is incredibly messy and horrible, and always stirs up a can of worms whenever you mention it. I'd be interested to see the YouTube comments underneath this episode. But it's always it's one of those things that almost seems like a distraction, but it certainly is like an eye-catching feature of this police and sentencing bill. The final one that's on this list is people in protest camps can be jailed for up to 3 months. So protest camps, I had to look a little into what they mean by this. So,
but can I guess, and then you can tell me if I'm wrong?
Yeah, go ahead.
So my assumption here is they're talking about, so there's been increased chatter about the kind of people who like set up tunnels and things like that to protest, say, HS2. And I think there's the famous guy who tunneled under a bypass in like the mid 90s, and that those would often be associated with camps who'd like camp along the roadside or where they're going to be building to try and stop infrastructure being built where they didn't think it should be. Generally, my understanding is those were generally environmental concerns, but I may not be fully au fait with all of the details. Is that kind of thing?
I think you're on the right line. Certainly, it's protest camps are where people set up residence where they're not meant to be, even if it's only temporary. So the example that's being used is the Extinction Rebellion protests, where protesters would like simply sit in the middle of a road or take claim to Piccadilly Circus or wherever it was, and set the Extinction Rebellion boat up there and say, look, we are occupying this land to protest for environmentalism. And apparently police officers felt that they had very few powers to remove those people or how they dealt with those in a sensible way. This bill wants to give, basically say that people in these camps, if they refuse to move, can be fined up to £2,500 or jailed for up to 3 months. Again, it's something where if you want to apply it to like Extinction Rebellion type protests, one that a lot of people found quite disruptive to daily life in London, some people may see that as a good thing, but people also feel that it might threaten, like those powers might be widened to threaten things like wild camping, ramblers, travellers communities. Like, what can you define as a protest camp and get people to move out in this way? That's quite worrying, and also quite worrying that it's kind of reducing the number of protest methods that have been available to people. I think Extinction Rebellion were able to promote their idea quite effectively just because of that type of protest. To make the entire thing illegal, how do people go about that? What is the right way to protest under these rules? I think is the ultimate answer. I can't protest by myself because I might be caused to protest and do that. I can't cause too much of a serious annoyance. I can't set up in a camp to promote it. The only way I can legally protest is going to the police saying, please, can I have a protest, please? And the police will then limit me on the time of that protest and how loud I'm allowed to be. And that really hamstrings maybe how effective that protest is and how I hold the government or whoever it is that I'm trying to hold to account. Where do we go from here if we enforce all of those rules? How do I get my message across? If I'm not part of a government or a government structure, I'm entirely reliant on the opposition party to get my view across, I guess, rather than these grassroots activist movements. And
I mean, there are multiple issues where we know that our current opposition are not particularly strong on. I don't just mean like Keir Starmer specifically, but like we saw problems with the Labour Party with the anti-Semitism stuff. They've had problems around trans people as well. You can't, if you only have one opposition, they can only oppose so many things. And so you need, the people need a way to make these things heard that allows them to come into the public conversation and therefore get in front of government. And given that, the petition service seems to be being mostly ignored by the government after it was set up, there's all these ways that we're supposed to be able to contact people, and it doesn't really work, I think is my short answer.
Yes, we're given more avenues to sort of get our opinions out there, but even less assurances that they'll ever be acted on or anyone will listen. So it's worrying that more direct forms of protest, they're also trying to shut that down, which seems it's just another way that we can't get our voices across. And like you said, there's problems with the opposition, but these movements that we've seen in the summer and now, like the Black Lives Matter movement, like this movement that's coming in the wake of what happened to Sarah Everard, they're not necessarily movements that would have as much impact if they came from a political party. Having them as these organic social movements, something that comes from the grassroots, I think is what makes them so successful. And they don't have a political party tied to them, that you get these new ideas explored and discussed in an open way that I simply don't believe that the Labour Party would just start talking about these rights. They have now, but they started talking because the conversation was started by people online and the response to a terrible incident and how we can make things better. So, the fact that these incidents might become few and further between, that we can't have those protests in the future that might lead to these conversations, it is again worrying that you might lead to sort of like a stagnation in thinking in general. So, unfortunately, this bill has already passed its second reading in the House of Commons. I think it moves on to its third fairly soon. And it does seem that with the Conservative government in charge and the majority of their MPs backing it, that it's very unlikely that this bill will fail to go through. I think maybe the one saving grace we've got is that it depends how the Lords see this bill, and if enough of them are worried about those 10-year rules for annoyance, those 10-year rules for statues. The Lords tend to do a pretty good job of picking up on the minutiae of bills, those sort of phrases, and trying to get them changed. So I'd be really interested to see what the Lords' opinion is on this bill. And if that comes up when they send it, most likely they will send it back to the Commons to be revoted on, because the Lords has been a fairly effective way of ping-ponging what I would call the more extreme rules back to Parliament and try and get them to amend them.
Yeah, so I think we just need to watch this space. I know we've not had polls for a few weeks. I wondered if you wanted to cover the polls with the upcoming Scottish election.
Oh, yes. If you've got a poll, please show it to me.
There's a polls of polls from Politico. So I thought this was kind of interesting to look through. So I think most people are aware that the SNP are the majority party in the Scottish Parliament, led by Nicola Sturgeon. And I think it would be reasonable to say their handling of the pandemic was generally more praised than that of Boris Johnson. So I think it's not surprising if you look at this poll up until like the start of 2021, the SNP has over 50% of the electorate polled for their regional parliament. Conservatives a bit lower down. Labour were kind of slowly taking away from the Conservatives, and then Lib Dems, the Brexit party, who I didn't realise had a foothold in Scotland really, Green Party and UKIP kind of all down the bottom. I mean, Lib Dems are the biggest of those as always, but I mean, they're not going to win a majority of the seats, so I don't think it's a massive concern. What is interesting is starting in mid-January, you start to see an uptick. So Labour and the Conservatives are kind of following each other almost in lockstep. So they're now Conservatives on 23% and Labour on 19%. And the SNP started dropping down and is now down to 49%. I'm not sure it's enough, personally, for the outcome of the election to change. I would expect Scotland to end up with a SNP parliament again, but it does, I think, start to show some of the fallout of what was happening with Alex Salmond and Nicola Sturgeon in recent weeks.
Yeah, I think that personal scandal that has dogged the SNP will certainly have a negative impact on their rating. Nicola Sturgeon alleged to have misled the Scottish Parliament recently in their statements about Alex Salmond to there, which is a fairly serious allegation. It's one that she denies and one that she says is a partisan leak. So I think we haven't quite seen the end of that story, but it's certainly damaged the SNP's prospects and has, although we don't have the polls in front of us, I know that support for Scottish independence, sort of when the SNP was seen to be managing the COVID crisis far better than the English government, the will for Scottish independence was at like 54%. It was the highest it's ever been. I think now it's far back more to level pegging, if not, support for the union has gone up. So that will naturally dent the SNP's hope of getting re-elected as well. I think there also might be this is, my opinion on this matter, but I think a stricter lockdown policy was very popular in the early days of COVID, and Scotland tends to have a more conservative approach to it. Now, later, has always had a more conservative approach on how they open up things up there. However, the longer it goes on, the more you get this sort of lockdown fatigue. And there might be starting to get a bit of backlash between how the SNP is managing that in the long term and people looking to see a opening up of things in Scotland, and maybe it's not happening at quite the pace people want, and that might be denting their hopes slightly. It's always very interesting to note that the Scottish Parliament, the way the electoral system was designed there, it's meant to essentially stop a majority, stop one party getting a majority. It's always meant to produce these coalition governments and having people working together. It's been a testament to how popular the SNP have been up there that they've been able to run majority governments for so long. I think it'll be really interesting this time round to see if the SNP can hold on to their majority rule, or if they'll have to go into like a minority government or team up with the Lib Dems, Labour, whoever wants to join a coalition with them. What's certain is that the unionist parties in the form of the Conservative, Labours and Lib Dems, that's always going to be a split vote up there. It's just a question of how much they split the vote. I think it appears that the Conservatives seem to be gobbling up more of that unionist vote than Labour. But for a lot of people up in Scotland, it would be a very hard decision to vote Conservative, given how generally the Conservatives have never been that popular up in Scotland for a long time, since the 1980s. The fact they're at 23% now is maybe electoral high point for where they've been in recent years.
Yeah. I just want to add, you mentioned about the potential of a second independence referendum. Just to summarise, there is a poll also on that same page that basically shows what you said. So back at the start of lockdown, essentially, it was neck and neck, yes and no, 46%, 46%. Throughout lockdown, the yeses increased to a peak of 50%, which I would still contend is not enough to win a majority in a referendum. It should be 2/3. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a bit like the polling for the Brexit referendum, where it was like it went up to 50%. It has now settled back down to yes and no at 45%, kind of just swapping spaces, so slightly more undecided voters. But yes, it doesn't seem like there is an obvious mandate for one choice of action there. So yeah, I think we'll see what happens with that. But I mean, I don't think it's likely that the UK government, would give the Scottish Parliament the chance to run a referendum anytime soon. Not while we have Conservatives in power. So, as always, Rob, thank you for joining us and giving me your political insights and giving them to our listeners. As I always say, you can find us at parliamentary.observer, where you can find the episodes, comment on the shows, and find links to various podcatchers where you can follow the show if you're not already. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at Unparl Podcast. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language, and you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And of course, you can always support us on Patreon at patreon.com/TTSS, where you'll get a bonus episode of Rob and I rambling before the show normally about a variety of topics. And one of those will be hopefully in your feed in the next month to show you what that's like. See if you want to come along and throw some money our way to help support hosting, support the cost of running this equipment, having various software subscriptions to be able to edit the audio and so on and so forth. But I don't think there's anything else for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Join Mike and Tom for nerdy conversation with a multitude of guests on Hat of Many Things.
Say hi, guys.
Hi, guys.
Hello.
I'm Mark, a librarian and professional wrestling ring announcer.
I cast League of Legends.
Soteros Philbrucato, best known for my work with White Wolf and Onyx Path Publishing on the World of Darkness.
Hi, I'm Jason Carl. I'm the producer of V5 at White Wolf.
Yeah, my name is Johanna Pettersson. I'm a Finnish game designer.